They came at the American fleet with every flight deck and every plane left in the Imperial Navy. Wave after wave of dive and torpedo bombers, along with their escorting Zero fighters. Launched from the 9 fleet carriers left to the Japanese, a larger attack group than the one that had devastated Battleship Row at Pearl Harbor some 3 years before, now closed in on the American fleet off Saipan. Only 4 days before, the U.S. Marines and Army put 4 divisions ashore on that island, and while the fighting was fierce, the Japanese would lose unless they could destroy the American fleet. Offshore lay the vulnerable transports, heavily laden LSTs, ammunition ships, and cargo vessels. Those were the real targets, but first, the Japanese aviators had to clear the way to them by knocking out Admiral Mark Mitcher's Task Force 58. With 15 carriers and over 800 planes, Mitcher's force represented the most powerful naval juggernaut in history. On the morning of June 19, 1944, when the first wave of incoming Japanese planes registered on radar screens throughout the fleet, the power of the American Navy was put to the ultimate test. A clash between the 2 mightiest fleets ever assembled. Within minutes of detecting the Japanese planes, Task Force 58 launched its Grumman Hellcat fighters. Fast, well-armed, and built like a brick outhouse, the F-6F Hellcat had no peer in naval aviation.
I think it was the best airplane. It wasn't the fastest, it was as maneuverable about any, but it was a good fighter for its job.
It proved itself out to be the best dogfighting fighter, all-around fighter of the war.
Flown by veteran pilots who had helped crush Japanese land-based air power in the Central Pacific only a few months before, the Hellcats waded into the Japanese planes. The result was a slaughter. Within minutes, the Hellcat pilots had cut a wide swath through the Japanese formations.
We had 5,000-foot advantage on them, so I came in and pulled right in behind a Zero and blasted him. A wing just went off, come on completely, and with the speed I had, I was able to pull back up and get ready to come back in again. And the other group behind us was just hit, so planes were everywhere. And so I saw one loner going out of the flight, going down low, and I peeled in behind him. And as I went down, and he evidently saw me coming, so he pulled up and tried to do a right flop on me, and it was just, he was just sitting up there, and I was able to hit him with no problem at all. And then I was down on the deck then, I was down low, so I pulled back up and did a Cuban 8 and rolled back into where the melee was going on. And when I got to the very top, didn't want to lose my speed, but I had, so I turned over to the left, and there was one F6 coming in on a Zero, and I pulled in behind him, and I guess he thought I was a Japanese airplane there, because there was tracer going everywhere. I wasn't shooting, but he for some reason he did a split S and just went out of there and left this Zero head up, just running for his life. And so he did 4 or 5 jinks back and forth, and I was able to nail him finally, and for the third one. And like I said, the fight it only lasted for maybe 20 minutes, probably not that long.
Across the horizon, the sailors of Task Force 58 watched as scores of Japanese planes fell, spiraling downwards while leaving great plumes of smoke in their wake.
They gave us a kind of a running account of this thing, you know. They told us what was happening, and we could hear these pilots talking and back and forth, and so we pretty much knew that it was a really a blowout.
Japanese aircraft that somehow managed to elude the American combat air patrols faced thousands of anti-aircraft cannon and machine guns. Few Japanese lived through the hail of steel generated by Task Force 58 to mount a serious attack.
When the actual firing began, it was so chaotic because the empty shells would be flying out the bottom, and you're getting new shells to put in. And again, like I said, you don't know where your shells are going, other than there's a plane up there somewhere and you're trying to get it, but you don't have time to say, well, I wonder where that one went, or did he hit him on that one?
By day's end, Japan had ceased to exist as a naval air power. So complete was the victory that the Americans labeled the battle the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The rise of American naval power was complete. For generations to come, the United States Navy would rule the seas. After the epic carrier battles of 1942, 1943 marked a period of recovery and regrouping for both the American and Japanese navies. In the United States, strategies developed before the war were analyzed and refined, and new equipment brought online. The loss of Hornet at Santa Cruz reduced the U.S. Pacific operational carrier fleet to one, the battered but seemingly unsinkable Enterprise. 13 months later, when the U.S. Fifth Fleet began its advance across the Central Pacific, 6 large and 5 light carriers, with an additional 6 escort carriers, spearheaded the campaign. The U.S. Navy's carrier fleet had risen from the brink of extinction to become the world's most potent naval strike force. The groundwork for this dramatic turnaround was laid in 1940 when President Roosevelt signed the Two-Ocean Navy Bill, authorizing the construction of 11 Essex-class fleet carriers. Incorporating all the best features of the Yorktown class, which immediately preceded it, Essex-class carriers were 60 feet longer, 10 feet wider at the waterline, and more than a third heavier. The longer, wider flight deck and the addition of an elevator positioned on the side of the carrier allowed for uninterrupted flight operations and greatly enhanced the ship's offensive and defensive air power. The additional size also allowed the complement of aircraft on board to increase, with 36 fighters, 36 dive bombers, and 18 torpedo planes comprising a typical air group in 1943. The experiences of 1942 had shown just how vulnerable carriers were to attack. So to enhance survivability, armor protection was added to the hangar deck, and the number of anti-aircraft guns dramatically increased. Known as the fast carriers, the Essex class could reach 33 knots and had a whopping range of 15,000 nautical miles. By November 1943, 7 Essex-class carriers were in operation, and with them, another 8 light fleet carriers that were rushed through production in the aftermath of the Pearl Harbor attack. In January 1942, work was halted on the Cleveland-class light cruiser Amsterdam, and she was reconfigured as the nation's first Independence-class light fleet carrier. Although cruiser-size aircraft carriers had shown their limitations, 9 CVLs were converted and launched, their principal virtues being near-term availability and the speed necessary to operate in fleet carrier task groups. Built as they were on slim cruiser hulls, their flight decks were long and, for an aviator attempting to land, alarmingly narrow. A small island and 4 stacks issued from starboard, and elevators fore and aft accessed the hangar deck, which was capable of holding 45 planes. To compensate for this additional topside weight, concrete-filled blisters were added below the waterline, which increased the original beam by 5 feet. Even so, Independence-class carriers were notorious for their poor handling and suffered a relatively high aircraft accident rate. Although they were not a great success, CVLs did provide the U.S. Navy with fleet carriers when the need was more than urgent. A third class of carrier, the CVE or Escort, provided air cover to the plodding transports and freighters of the amphibious fleet, which allowed the fleet carrier arm to concentrate solely on offensive operations. The first escort carriers were converted from merchant ships or oilers, but beginning in 1943, CVEs were designed and built as aircraft carriers from the keel up. Lightly armored, slower than the fleet carriers, and with far less defensive armament and aircraft, they were also less expensive and could be built in less time.
One of the unsung success stories of American industry in World War II was the escort carrier. The Navy called them CVE, CV being the designation for an aircraft carrier and E for escort. However, the sailors and aviators who were assigned to escort carriers always insisted that CVE stood for combustible, vulnerable, and expendable.
Whether providing air cover for amphibious landings, ferrying planes, resupplying the big carriers, or performing tactical airstrikes in support of ground forces ashore, the baby flat tops did whatever task had to be done. By the end of the war in August 1945, 20 Essex-class, 9 Independence-class, and 78 escort carriers had been launched, a testament to the immense capacity of America's wartime industry. In contrast, the Japanese completed only 4 fleet carriers during the war, supplemented by a hodgepodge of improvised conversions. Aircraft production also lagged far behind that of the Americans. For instance, the follow-on to the Kate, the Nakajima B-6N2 Jill, did not enter service until the second half of 1944, and fewer than 1,300 were produced. By comparison, Grumman and Eastern Aircraft churned out nearly 11,000 Avengers for the U.S. Navy and British Fleet Air Arm. Hampered throughout the war by the predations of American submarines on her merchant fleet, and later the effects of a sustained bombing campaign on her factories, Japan's manufacturing base simply could not maintain full-scale production. The final and perhaps most important advantage the Americans possessed by this point in the war was in the quantity and quality of its air crews. By 1943, more than 30,000 naval aviators were in training, none of whom were assigned to an operational squadron without a minimum of 600 hours of training. In Japan, emergency training programs were sending air crews into combat with as little as 50 hours flying experience.
I've had the occasion to get to know Saburo Sakai, who was the top living Japanese fighter ace to survive the war, and he makes the point that pilot trainees who were thrown out of training before the war were far better than some of those who actually went to combat flying Japanese Navy aircraft just a couple of years later.
Because the Zero was so easily destroyed in air-to-air combat, these new Japanese pilots didn't have the chance to come up their learning curve in combat and become experienced fighter pilots. There's an old fighter pilot saying, fly 5 and stay alive. Because the Zero was so fragile, these pilots didn't get the opportunity to fly 5 and stay alive. And as a result, there's a steady disintegration of pilot quality in the Japanese air groups, starting in 1942, but really accelerating through 43 and 44.
After the triumph at Guadalcanal early in 1943, the immediate American strategy remained focused on securing the Solomons and New Guinea in the Southwest Pacific Theater, operations that could rely on air cover from Marine and Army Air Forces based at Henderson Field and in New Guinea. The grand strategy of how best to quickly defeat Japan was far more contentious. General Douglas MacArthur believed the road to Tokyo required a northward advance through the Philippines via the Solomons and New Guinea, while Admirals Ernest J. King and Chester Nimitz argued the more direct route to Japan lay across the Central Pacific. Ultimately, it was decided to pursue both options. Forces under the command of General MacArthur would simultaneously attack the northern Solomons and leapfrog westerly along the coast of northern New Guinea, isolating Japanese garrisons stationed there and ultimately bypassing Rabaul. Admiral Nimitz would begin the drive across the Central Pacific with invasions of Tarawa and Macon in the Gilbert Islands, before proceeding further west across the Pacific toward Japan. Meanwhile, the desire to engage the American fleet in a winner-take-all battle continued to dictate Japanese strategy.
The Japanese went into the war with a fleet at least as powerful as the American fleet, but they knew if it was a long war of attrition, they would lose because American shipbuilding capabilities would overpower them. So they were looking for the decisive battle, the one big battle, the clash of the battle lines, a battle of annihilation where their battleships would sink the American ones and it would be over. The war would be done.
Aware that their carrier force was no longer a match for the Americans, the Japanese command turned to their own land-based air power to redress the balance. The result was a plan called Operation Ago. The idea was to lure American ships into Japanese-controlled waters, where they would be destroyed by an overwhelming stream of both land and carrier-based planes. The decisive blow would fall when the Americans moved against either the Caroline or Palau Islands. But that ultimate test would have to wait. because in the fall of 1943, the U.S. Fifth Fleet began flexing its muscles elsewhere. The first demonstration of the Fifth Fleet's tremendous flexibility and hitting power came in November 1943, when task groups of the Fast Carrier Force began hitting targets in a 1,600-mile arc from the Marshall Islands in the north to Bougainville in the south. Built around Essex and Independence-class flat tops and ringed with heavily armed battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, these task groups possessed unrivaled mobility. Within hours of an airstrike on a Japanese base, the task force was speeding away, out of range of enemy bombers bent on retaliation. Days later, the Americans could strike again, hundreds of miles away. The landing of the 3rd Marine Division on Bougainville on November 1st and a carrier-based raid on Rabaul on the 5th convinced the Japanese High Command that the threat in the Southwest Pacific was greater than that of an attack in the Central Pacific. Forces intended for the defense of the Marshall and Gilbert Islands were thus redeployed. However, it was in the Gilberts that the Americans planned to begin their Central Pacific offensive. By mid-November, the most powerful U.S. naval force assembled in the Pacific up to that time, numbering some 190 warships in 4 task groups, was converging on the Tarawa and Makin atolls in the Gilbert Islands. The pending operation was a stepping stone for future landings in the nearby Marshall Islands. The planners wanted to establish airfields and naval bases in the Gilberts and give U.S. forces valuable experience in amphibious operations. Prior to the invasion, the softening up process began as carrier and land-based bombers carried out hundreds of missions against Japanese airfields throughout the Gilberts and Marshalls and against gun positions, bunkers, and storage areas on Baishio, the largest islet on the Tarawa Atoll.
Our fighter sweeps would clear the air if there was fighter opposition, and then we'd go right into strafing mode. And you get your AA batteries, your gun batteries. We spent all kinds of time strafing those.
That was never any fun. When you're diving in there and you're looking and they're firing at you and you're seeing these, we call them the meatballs, red hot meatballs going by. As long as they were going by you underneath, you knew they weren't going to hit you.
The Americans subjected Baishio to the largest pre-invasion bombardment of the war to date, but it wasn't nearly enough.
They thought they'd done a great job, but looks were deceiving. Very few of the Japanese positions were taken out. Some of the large guns were, but none of the troop positions worth mentioning.
When the 2nd Marine Division went ashore on November 20th, it was met by murderous fire from deeply entrenched Japanese defenders.
To the degree that the Japanese fire had been suppressed, some of them got to the beach and some of them got over the seawall, at least they were trying. But then the Japanese recovered and were just firing everything they had, basically into the faces of these Marines, who couldn't see all of the bunkers and pillboxes in front of them, couldn't see the nature of the gunfire that was coming at them, and couldn't see where it was coming from. These are the best Japanese troops the Marines or anybody in the Pacific faced from start to finish. These guys were formidable foes. And it's a good thing we met them that early because we based our training and the dedication of firepower on future landings to that level. And the Japanese in any other landing never met that level. So we not only overwhelmed them, we double overwhelmed them by taking into account the best that we met at Tarawa and never meeting them again.
Although carrier aircraft flew missions in support of the men on the ground, poor communications and coordination limited their effectiveness. Meanwhile, the fighter squadrons provided a protective umbrella for the fleet. The Japanese launched occasional air attacks, but they came in small groups and were easily handled by the patrolling Hellcats.
Betty was here, it was right on the water, it was running, it had engines wide open, and it was moving. And I just came right up behind it, and I gave him a long burst. Boom. He hit, blew up. I pulled back and went up through some of the debris, which if, when I got more experienced, I would have fired from back farther, and then I would have turned off, not gone through debris.
Though it took only 76 hours to secure the island, some 3,300 Marines were either killed or wounded during the brief but violent fight. Naval casualties added hundreds more when a Japanese submarine torpedoed the escort carrier Liscum Bay.
There was a loud explosion, seemed like just under me. Fire was raging everywhere. A shipmate of mine, a bosun's mate for the flight deck, had a little compartment right by where I was. I opened the door to tell them to get out of there or to help them. It was obvious there was nobody left in there.
23 minutes after the torpedo hit, Liscum Bay sank, taking with her 643 men. There were only 272 survivors. It had been a costly battle, and much had gone wrong. But coupled with the capture of Macon, the United States now possessed bases from which an attack could be launched against the highly strategic Marshall Islands. The carriers headed back to Pearl Harbor to get ready for that next step. Part of that preparation meant absorbing the lessons of the past few months. The lack of a strong air response from the Japanese suggested that the pre-invasion effort to neutralize airfields on adjacent island groups had been effective, but that the airstrikes and naval shelling Baishio was subjected to had failed to suppress the Japanese defenses. Clearly, naval gunfire of greater duration and accuracy was required prior to a landing, as was better coordination between the assault troops and the planes in the air. Improved close air support would help reduce casualties and shorten the battle for each island on the road to Tokyo. At the same time, better weapons were needed to knock out Japanese strongpoints. The concrete and coconut log bunkers and pillboxes encountered at Tarawa absorbed even 500-pound bomb hits. Word got back to the States that the pilots needed a true bunker buster, and at China Lake Naval Air Station, they came up with a solution.
This is Tiny Tim, the biggest and heaviest rocket built in this year of our Lord, 1944.
The Tiny Tim air-to-ground missile was the largest American rocket deployed during World War II. But early testing revealed that the engine was too powerful to allow the rocket to be launched from directly beneath an aircraft. As a solution to the problem, a launcher was developed that swung the rocket below the aircraft's fuselage before ignition. Though this method showed promise in ground tests, damage to the airframe was still occurring when fired during combat simulations. Consequently, a second method was tested, which eventually became standard. The rocket was simply dropped like a bomb, and when a lanyard that extended between the aircraft and the weapon broke, the rocket ignited, propelling it to about 550 miles per hour. Though it saw only limited service in World War II, it helped form the foundations of many post-war developments in rocketry. In this first Central Pacific campaign, the reconfigured air groups had shown their potential, but even greater versatility was desired. Toward that end, the Grumman F-6F-5 included hardpoints under the wings for mounting rockets and bombs. By war's end, the fighter-bomber had become the fleet's main offensive threat. Despite some hard lessons, the carriers of the Fifth Fleet had proven themselves beyond a shadow of a doubt. They had covered an arc of operations thousands of miles long, performed numerous hit-and-run strikes, and provided air cover and pre-invasion bombardment for major amphibious operations at Bougainville and Tarawa. But this was only the beginning. In the months to come, the Fast Carrier Task Force would be unleashed against the most formidable Japanese bases in the Pacific. In mid-January 1944, the newly formed Task Force 58 slowly filed out of Pearl Harbor and set a course southwest for the Marshall Islands. Divided into 4 distinct task groups, the Big Blue Fleet would not return to Pearl Harbor until the war's end. To hasten that day, American military strategists had come up with an ambitious plan.
One of the more dramatic developments in wartime strategy was the phenomenon known as island hopping. Thanks to the mobility afforded by aviation and by the fast carrier task forces, American forces discovered that it would not be necessary to reduce every Japanese position as one advanced across the Pacific. It would be possible to bypass a lot of the major garrisons and simply set up shop behind them and keep those garrisons neutralized with air power.
The American forces put this new military strategy to the test when at the end of January 1944, they bypassed the fortified outermost atolls in the Marshalls to make an amphibious assault on Kwajalein. The Kwajalein Atoll had been in Japanese hands for decades, and it was assumed that it would be defended as vigorously as Tarawa. A sustained air campaign from air bases in the Gilberts and later from the aircraft carriers of Task Force 58 pounded the atoll prior to the landings and wreaked havoc on base facilities, aircraft, and personnel. Beginning on January 31st, a twin amphibious assault fell on the main islands of Roy and Namur in the north and Kwajalein in the south.
This operation was short and bloody. The Marines knew what to expect, met the defenses in a way more sophisticated manner with their eyes open. Heavier bombardment, so forth. There were heavy casualties taken initially, but we captured a base almost as cheaply as you could in a contested landing at that point.
With Kwajalein secure, Admiral Nimitz recommended an immediate strike on Eniwetok, a coral atoll surrounding a deep central lagoon approximately 300 miles northwest of Kwajalein. Though the total land area was scarcely more than 2 miles, Eniwetok nevertheless was strategically important. Aircraft stationed there could begin softening up the Marianas in preparation for an amphibious assault on the islands and provide additional air cover once the operation was underway.
Almost everything that is going to be accomplished in the Pacific is either done for or by the air arms of both the Army and the Navy. That's why they're fighting in Guadalcanal in late 42 and early 43. That's why the Marines will later on land at Tarawa. It's all about air bases. It's all about who's going to control those air bases and how you're going to use those air bases.
To cover the assault on Eniwetok, Admiral Mitcher's Task Force 58 was assigned the job of conducting a full-scale strike against Truk, a formidable airbase and staging point between Japan and the South Pacific, and the best fleet anchorage in all the Japanese-mandated islands.
A lot of us that had just heard about it, studied it a little bit, I'll have to admit, I was a little apprehensive about Truk, not having any idea what we were going to run into. We just knew there was a lot of stuff there.
Although the Truk raid was ordered partly to cover the Eniwetok landing, of even greater importance was the opportunity to strike the Japanese combined fleet as it lay at anchor in an American version of Pearl Harbor. Reconnaissance flights over Truk in early February showed much of the Imperial fleet at anchor within the lagoon, but also alerted the Japanese of a possible attack. As a result, most heavy units withdrew westward to Palau prior to the American raids, but numerous lighter vessels and hundreds of aircraft remained. After an early morning launch on February 17th, the first Hellcats to arrive over Truk encountered only moderate resistance and easily swept aside their Japanese adversaries.
I saw a plane kind of ducking in and out of a cloud down below zero, and one moment we come down, he'd get back into a deeper cloud deal. But so what I did, I went up sun, and came down on him when he didn't know what hit him.
Wave after wave of American aircraft thundered in, bombing and strafing anything they could find on the runways, seaplane ramps, and within the anchorage itself.
This one destroyer was making for the open sea, And I wound up flying wing on a guy by the name of Bob Dibb, who had already been out there on a couple of cruises. And he hauls off and makes a run on this destroyer. And evidently he knew what he was doing, because he picked on the fantail, strafed it with his 650s, and pulled up out of there. The whole fantail blew up on that ship, and I'm still coming downhill on it. And I flew through the biggest bunch of garbage you ever wanted to see. And so he got the destroyer kill, and he liked to got me as his wingman.
The attack caught the Japanese almost completely off guard, but they did manage to fight back.
I'm on the starboard catapult, and truck's over here in that direction. And everybody started running around on the deck and wondering what was going on, and came over the radio from combat CIC that 12 torpedo planes approaching from 15,000 yards from the starboard. And they were giving me the turn up, you know, the catapult officer was, and shot me off. And off I went, and I made a sharp turn to the starboard, and I'm head in with 12 torpedo bombers coming straight at the ship. Well, all I had to do was just, I'm pointing right on one, and I just whipped it off, and he just disappeared. He exploded. Well, I made a mistake after that. I pulled straight up into a chandelle and rolled back over and got behind them. But here we go, right through this big fleet. And here's these 12 torpedo bombers that every ship in the fleet is shooting at, and here I am behind them, chasing them, you know. And so it seemed like 30 minutes getting through that fleet, but it probably was about 2 minutes or less that we got through.
We got torpedoed that night on the Intrepid, and I was asleep in bed in a sack here about 2 o'clock in the morning, and some Kate enemy torpedo plane came up the wake of the ship and got our stern, got our rudder, and so we had to retire from action and come back to Pearl Harbor. They had to rig a sail up in the forecastle, up in the bow, to counter the effect of the rudder being jammed the way it was, so kind of funny.
The air groups of Task Force 58 flew more than 1,200 sorties against Truk over a 2-day period. And although the attack missed Japanese capital ships, 3 destroyers, 7 fleet auxiliaries, 6 tankers, and 17 freighters were either sunk or incapacitated. Japanese aircraft losses were estimated at well over 200. When the operation was over, Truk lay in ruins. Never again would Japanese warships venture there. Never again would it pose a threat to the Allies in the Pacific.
You can imagine being the Japanese and taking those kind of losses. And that's the great thing about Task Group 58. It was such a punch that the Japanese, wherever they were hit, they just didn't recover. 58 Task Force and the submarines did the Japanese in.
American losses during the raid were surprisingly light. 35 aircraft were shot down, but submarines stationed as lifeguards rescued the majority of the air crews.
When we'd make an attack on an island, we'd station 2 or 3 submarines offshore to rescue pilots that were damaged or shot up in the attacks. So we put out a little patrol over each one of these submarines to protect it while it was saving our pilots.
Beginning with the Gilbert Islands campaign, submarines were routinely assigned specific stations in the area of air operations. Pilots forced to ditch sent an uncoded radio message that alerted the patrolling submarine. The system worked. More than 500 downed airmen were plucked from the water by American submarines. In the 4 months that had elapsed since the beginning of the Central Pacific Campaign, 5th Fleet carriers had ranged virtually unchallenged from the Solomons to the Marianas. The Japanese combined fleet made no attempt to counter these moves, and in fact had been forced to retreat from Rabaul to Truk, and then from Truk to Palau. But the Americans took no satisfaction from the stalling tactics adopted by the Japanese. Task Force 58 had avenged Pearl Harbor and had gained the strategic initiative. Now it was determined to track down and kill the combined fleet. In the autumn of 1943, a new factor entered into the strategic picture of the war against Japan. The Army Air Force announced the imminent appearance of a very long-range bomber, the B-29 Superfortress. With a 1,500-mile cruising radius, the B-29 can make non-stop strategic strikes on the Japanese home islands from a suitable base. Saipan, 1,270 nautical miles from Tokyo, was slated for invasion. Admiral Raymond Spruance's Fifth Fleet would transport 80,000 Marines and nearly 50,000 soldiers to Saipan. They would be escorted by Task Force 58, the weapon with which the U.S. Navy planned to destroy the Japanese combined fleet when and if it ventured forth to support the Marianas garrisons.
Preparations were long, arduous, and comprehensive. Many heavy bomber attacks on the airfields basically destroyed the air capacity. It was by far, up to that point, the most complex landing operation. As complex as D-Day was handled, over 40 miles of water. This was handled over several thousand miles of water. I mean, units were sent directly from the United States aboard ship, units were sent from Hawaii aboard ship, and they met there, and it all came together. Everything that they learned from Tarawa and had perfected by Kwajalein was amply perfected, albeit on a much broader scale.
As the invasion date neared, fighter sweeps of the skies above the Marianas discovered that land-based bombers had only made a minor dent in the Japanese defenses.
Everything we did started pre-dawn. We'd start the takeoff just before dawn, and we didn't make any money by getting up that early and doing it because it took us forever to get rendezvoused in the dark and get off on our strike course. Well, this particular mission, it's ordered for Sunday afternoon. Why Sunday afternoon? Well, intelligence people said we're going to catch the Japanese pilots at the officers' club in a swimming pool. We are? Well, anyway, we make our sweep on Guam, expecting to catch all the planes on the ground and everybody having a brunch or at the swimming pool. And it ain't so. The airplanes aren't on the ground. They're all up in the air. Fighters are way up above us. And we ran into this terrific ground fire. We lost 3 pilots to what we believe were the 5-inch size weapon. Then the Zeros jumped us. But that was a good scrap. We made many strikes on Guam, but that was the fighter sweep.
On June 15th, following 2 days of near-continuous naval shelling, the largest amphibious operation of the Pacific War commenced. In spite of the heaviest pre-invasion bombardment to date, elements of the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions were under fire as soon as the landing started. Casualties were heavy, but by nightfall, the Marines had a beachhead about 5 miles wide and half a mile deep. The Japanese saw this massive operation as an opportunity to implement the Ago Plan, hoping for the decisive naval victory that had thus far eluded them. According to the plan, land-based aircraft from the Marianas, the southern Philippines, and the Carolines would inflict serious losses on the American fleet before the Japanese carrier fleet arrived to deliver the coup de grace.
Their objective here was to destroy the American carrier fleet by launching their planes, which had longer range than the American planes, from a long distance, about 240 miles or more, to strike and destroy the American fleet, and then the planes would fly on to the land bases that they had around in the Marianas. Well, in doing this, they would be able to strike a blow against the Americans and not receive one in return because they'd be out of American combat aircraft range.
What occurred instead was a disaster for the Imperial Japanese Navy in the last and greatest carrier clash of the Pacific War, the Battle of the Philippine Sea. On June 16th, the main portions of the Imperial fleet, consisting of 6 heavy and 3 light carriers and several battleships, rendezvoused in the western part of the Philippine Sea, a gathering that was duly noted by American submarines. By the afternoon of June 18th, Admiral Mark Mitcher's Task Force 58 was poised to meet an imminent attack. It came the next day, as the Japanese sent wave after wave of both land and carrier-based aircraft at the American task groups.
We were standby to the combat air patrol up above to be used in case they spotted them on radar. Well, sure enough, the radar spotted them. As a matter of fact, it turned out to be about 4 different raids coming in, and this was the first one.
They were intercepted shortly after 10:30, still 45 miles short of their objective, and the Hellcat pilots of Task Force 58 tore the Japanese formations to pieces.
And it was almost a perfect intercept. We were high by about 5,000 feet above the incoming planes. Turned out to be 12 Kates, they're torpedo planes. And we saw them well in advance and waited until they were right under us and all peeled off. And I think within a matter of seconds there were 10 or 11 burning Kates going down. It was, from a fighter pilot standpoint, it was just an ideal situation.
All of a sudden, my eyes practically bugged out. I saw a group of about 50, 60 enemy planes, all motley group, no formation type thing at all. So I came on in, burnt one real fast, and then pulled back up again and came on down again, and there were 2 in a loose wing. And so I got one real fast. He started on fire, was just heading down, trailing, and I just dipped a wing and went over to the next one and did the same thing. Then I saw a string of 3 of them in a loose string. They were getting pretty close. Our fleet was down very close by that time. Started seeing some black puffs up in our direction, battleships and all. So I got the back end one before he had started down. The one ahead of him, I must have hit the bomb or something, because boy, I'll tell you, he just blew into smithereens. And then I looked back and all I could see was burning pieces on the water in a trail of about 35 miles or so. And just as fast as it started, in 8 minutes that was.
The Battle of the Philippine Sea became a route known forever after by Americans as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, as Hellcat pilots shot hundreds of Japanese planes out of the sky.
We were getting into lesser trained pilots that time, and they didn't compare anything as to the ability of those when the war first broke out, or the first ones we saw.
Operation Augo was a complete failure. Conceived as a devastating attack on the American fleet, the effort had instead demolished Japan's own naval air groups. Inexperienced and outnumbered, the pilots and their obsolete aircraft were shot from the sky at an incredible rate. Aircraft losses exceeded 300, the greatest single-day aerial loss in the history of combat aviation. To make matters even worse for the Japanese, American submarines claimed 2 carriers. Those that remained withdrew towards the Philippines, their flight decks virtually empty.
That just made the Japanese Navy almost useless. I mean, they were good for kamikazes from then on. They didn't have enough experienced pilots to man any kind of attack or anything from carriers.
It had been an unparalleled day for Navy aviators, but Admiral Mark Mitcher wanted to follow up the aerial victory and sink the remaining Japanese carriers. The following day, Task Force 58 search planes probed westward for the fleeing, defenseless enemy ships.
The American carriers sent reconnaissance planes out, and that afternoon they finally located the Japanese fleet. Well, the decision was made to launch a strike against them, even though the Japanese carriers were at extreme range of the American Avengers and Helldivers, and they knew that by launching in the late afternoon, the strike aircraft would be coming back to the American fleet at night. The American pilots and air crew had not been trained for night carrier landings, and this was going to be problematical. But the decision was made to risk the air groups in return for destroying the Japanese carrier task force once and for all.
They gave us a position of the fleet, and it didn't sound, I think it was 187 miles bearing so-and-so. And as we came up, what we call the fly one position, this is where the signalman is to launch a deck launch. and the talker, who was holding a blackboard, and he's got his earphones on, and he's got a blackboard, and he's holding it against the wind over the deck. New enemy position. The bearing was a little bit different, but distance, 305 miles. And right at that time, you know, there's no way we're not going to get back. The fighters would be the best off, the torpedo planes the worst off, and the dive bombers in between. So you got this on your mind as you're going out. We start a long, gradual climb, and it was just dusk when the first thing. There were a lot of thunderheads in the general area, there with open sky in between. And the first thing you saw were the wakes. Apparently, they'd had us on radar by that time, and they'd gone to flank speed because you could see these tremendous white wakes of the force. So each ship, and it was turning into the wind to launch airplanes. And they didn't have too many left because of the raids the day before through Guam. So we continued climbing in, and the torpedo planes finally, we had coordinated attack. They break away and head towards the surface to do their low altitude run, and the dive bombers coming in underneath us to hit their pushover point at, say, 10,000 feet. And we're coming in over the top of them to protect them from any fighter opposition. Well, no fighter opposition appeared as we got into the actual pushover point. So we had the bomb, so one bomb is a 500 on each of the fighters. I remember Bill Dean taking his division, and I followed. And at that time, out of the corner of my eye, I caught the torpedo planes coming in low on the water, and we were diving on, I guess it was the Shokaku. And they were getting hits on it, and it's at full over helm, tight turn, and which was what you would expect to avoid the bombing, accuracy of the bombing, and so forth, and the torpedo attacks. And as we get lower, it gets darker and darker, because when you're at altitude, you can see the sun a little bit different than when you get down low, so it's getting darker and darker anyway. Dropped the bomb. My boys dropped the bombs. Whether, you got your head tucked between your shoulders, because the AA fire was horrendous. And one thing that I remember vividly is the color. There was purple bursts, lavender, greenish blue, as well as white and black. It was like 4th of July. I'd never seen anything. I'd seen AA, but not this colored stuff. And what it meant, I don't know. Something new to us. Anyway, dropped the bombs and recovered pretty close, down a few hundred feet, jinking, trying to get out of there without getting hit by the AA. And we knew right now that we probably wouldn't get back to the ship. We were the best off. It was going to be marginal. So you didn't stay. You headed immediately right back to the back home course, the reciprocal of what we came in on. And it's dark. And about a third of the way back, we started hearing the torpedo planes call out. It was not just our ship. There were other carriers and ships involved. Running out of gas, preparing to ditch, and call after call after call. The torpedo planes went in first because they had to carry that heavy torpedo load all the way to the target and back. Then the next were the dive bombers, the SB-2Cs. They started going in. We get back to the force, and it's black, and there's a haze. The visibility is not good. And so we've got 4 task groups, which says 16 carriers, and we're to find the one that is our carrier. Bill Dean with his 4, and I'm beside him, and it's night, and we got back to the force, and the skipper flew into some clouds, and I looked down and saw lights on the surface, and I dropped down because my fuel gauge was reading, half a dozen gallons or something like that. They're not accurate. And went down. And I located our carrier. You had an axis and you knew a position within a disposition. You knew that much. But you couldn't see any of the markings. The hulls had distinctive camouflage markings. You could tell them in the daytime. And so I located our ship with my 4 and broke and started around in the landing pattern. It was not yet into the wind and got a wave off. The LSO had colored wand sticks that they waved at night. Ship was turning. Came on around again, but I remember the glow of my running light reflecting off. In other words, I came within a few feet of digging a wing in that final turn. And it's a black of night. In those days, unlike today, the ships had little dustpan lights that were probably the equivalent of about 5 watts or 10 candle power or something. And until you got the cut, you really didn't see the flight deck. Then you'd see these little glows down the deck, and that was it. They had a string of lights that were strung on the port side aft, which gave you a vertical, and you knew that was the stern of the ship and the port side. And then the only masthead running light, and then the signal officer with his wands, and that was your total lighting at night. Something that I neglected to add, because there was hysteria, and I'll just call it hysteria. Pandemonium had developed. Nobody knew where their ships were. They were running out of fuel. We lost, not lost, but we had 4 of our pilots, Tex Vineyards Division, ran out of fuel right there by the ship. 2 of them ditched right alongside the ship, and 2 others went down in the landing pattern. But when it got to that state where, as I say, it was almost hysteria, and it's to be expected, they made the decision to turn on the lights. And that is quite famous in history today. Something you don't do when you're out there to illuminate your ships, you know, with submarines supposedly in the area and all of that. But they took the searchlights, which were up in the stack, level 9 or 10 or something like that on a carrier, and turned them down on the water alongside the ship and somewhat illuminated the flight deck a bit. We could tell which were the carriers. And then we had people making landing approaches on cruisers, destroyers, anything that had a light on it. And so that command, turn on the lights, from the task force, who was it, McCain at the time? Mark Mitcher, that's right, and turn on the lights. And that was a lifesaver. Those lights came on just while I was in my approach. I had already found the ship, so I was all right there. Anyway, I landed a bit. The ship was not yet into the wind, but when I did get the cut, it was kind of a cross deck. It ended up behind the number 4 twin mount, 5-inch mount. And my wingman came in and skipped over the wires and hit the barriers, and they had to cut him out and throw the plane over. We just pushed the airplanes overboard. You didn't recover anything. Get them off the deck, make the deck operable again.
We got aboard just at dusk, and when they started coming in, the word was land on any carrier you can find, and that's you see a guy making a pass on the destroyer light, you know, and
tough getting aboard because everybody wasn't panicking, but I guess they were panicking, trying to get aboard, and every time I would make a pass, somebody would cut inside me, and I'd have to wave off and try another one. Finally I got aboard. Jeez.
We took aboard 8 aircraft extra, that night, 8 aircraft from not on our own, and couldn't take any more. And we took 3 after that, and they'd land, get the pilot out, and we'd push them over the stern. We had a clear deck. Take another one, get the pilot out, push the airplane over the stern. We did that 3 times.
94 aircraft were lost during the mission Beyond Darkness, but of those, 80 either ran out of gas or crash-landed on deck. Miraculously, of the 209 airmen forced to ditch, 160 were rescued within a few days.
By the end of the second day of the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Japan's naval power had really been broken. The Mission Beyond Darkness had claimed the carrier Hayo and then had taken out the fleet train, the oilers and tankers supporting the Japanese carriers, and that severely limited their ability to operate at great distances from their bases at that point. But also, the 2 days of fighting had destroyed what was left of Japan's carrier-based naval aviation. So it didn't matter that a few carriers actually escaped. There weren't any aircraft to put on the flat tops, and even if there were planes, they didn't have the pilots to man them.
The Battle of the Philippine Sea dealt a mortal blow to Japanese aspirations in the Pacific. The Imperial fleet had sailed into battle intent on destroying Fifth Fleet's carriers, only to be shredded by the overwhelming superiority of American air power. With the United States Navy now in undisputed control of the air and waters surrounding Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, victory in the Marianas and an ultimate American triumph over Japan were all but inevitable. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was the fifth and last major carrier versus carrier battle of the Pacific War, and a resounding victory for the new Essex and Independence-class flat tops. Since the beginning of the Central Pacific Campaign just 8 months before, the Fifth Fleet had spearheaded a relentless drive that had shattered the outermost Japanese defense perimeter. Now redesignated as Third Fleet, its next task was to support MacArthur and the Seventh Fleet in the forthcoming Philippine campaign. This temporary convergence of the Central and Southwest Pacific offenses was not entirely to the Navy's liking. Having no personal stake in a return to the Philippines, Admiral King and the Navy wished to bypass the islands altogether, believing that an assault on Formosa was the next logical step. But MacArthur insisted the United States was honor-bound to liberate the Philippines at the earliest possible date. MacArthur ultimately prevailed, and a timetable was agreed upon that would systematically capture or neutralize the remaining Japanese air bases within range of the Philippines. By late August, strikes began in the Western Carolines. At the cutting edge of this strategy was the Fast Carrier Task Force, now under the command of Admiral Halsey and redesignated Task Force 38. Bolstered by the addition of 2 new Essex-class carriers, Franklin and Hancock, and the Independence-class San Jacinto, the ships of the Third Fleet sought to build on the momentum achieved during the preceding campaigns. The air groups had made history with the damage they had inflicted, the ships they had destroyed, and the aircraft they had downed, and the fighter squadrons had, if anything, become more important. Now, new versions of the Hellcat began reaching the fleet. With weapon hardpoints under the wings, the new F-6F-5 could carry up to 2,000 pounds of bombs or rockets, making it almost as powerful as the Helldiver, while being far more versatile. As a result, the bomber squadrons diminished in size and importance, while the fighter squadrons swelled.
By late in the war, squadrons of SP-2Cs and of TBM Avengers had dwindled to barely 12 to 15 aircraft in some instances because of the Corsair and the Hellcat being able to do so much as far as not only air-to-air but air-to-ground.
We sometimes carried 1 or 2 500-pound bombs or 6 5-inch rockets or, of course, the 650 caliber machine guns. We always used the machine guns no matter what we did.
In addition to the new role of fighter-bomber, other Hellcats were outfitted for night fighting. Equipped with flame-dampening gear and a modern airborne radar system, the Hellcat could now stalk its prey at night.
Our fighter directors would direct us out in back of the airplanes about 3 or 4 miles, and then we'd gradually overtake them until we saw them and shot them down.
By mid-September 1944, Task Force 38 had shifted its focus to the southern Philippines. The carrier air groups ranged throughout the islands, raiding Manila, smashing airfields, and pounding the Japanese without mercy.
We were on a fire sweep around the Del Carmen. I looked down and I saw these 7 Tonys lined up getting ready to take off. And I called KG and I said, KG, there's 7 Tonys down there getting ready to take off. I said, shall we go get them? And KG in his Alabama voice says, no, Diz, he says, we'll just circle here and wait till they get off, which we did. we circled 3 or 4 times. They started taking off, so finally, after about 4 or 5 of them got airborne, KG says, "Now is the time," and he rolled in, we all rolled in and started picking them off. And the 7th one, 6 of them got off, the 7th one didn't go. He saw what was happening to his buddies, and he jumped out of the cockpit and ran for the jungle. But we shot down the other 6.
Task Force 38's fighter sweeps continued to encounter only paltry resistance, which led Admiral Halsey to deduce that Japanese air power had all but evaporated. He recommended that the invasion of Leyte, originally scheduled for late December, be moved up 2 months. In an impressive display of strategic flexibility, the Joint Chiefs of Staff agreed, and the long-anticipated return to the Philippines